All right, I think we can get started and hopefully a few more people trickle in as we do an introduction here. But it is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Leland Werden from ETH Zurich's Crowther Lab. So Dr. Werden is a restoration and ecosystem ecologist. He did his PhD at University of Minnesota studying the restoration of tropical dry forests in Costa Rica. He did a postdoc at the University of Hawaii, where he continued to work on restoration, and he is now a lead scientist at ETH Zurich's Crowther Lab, where he really researches the cutting edge of restoration science and identifies and overcomes bottlenecks to scale the global restoration movement. Beyond his credentials, Leland's really impressive because he's been boots on the ground scaling restoration projects all over the world. That's not an exaggeration. He's helped establish native tree nurseries in local communities. He's set up large-scale reforestation plans and monitoring strategies. I think there's really very few people who have such intimate knowledge of what restoration requires at scale in so many different diverse habitats across the world. I've known Leland for a long time. He's a personal friend. It's a privilege to have him here and share his work with you all. And so I am going to pass it over now to Leland, and you should just be able to share your screen.
I just requested. Oh, there we go. Sweet.
Just allowed it.
Awesome. Thanks, Colin. That was an absolutely incredible introduction. I really appreciate you having me here as well. And I'm super excited to talk about some of the work that we've been developing over the past 3 years since I've been at ETH. And I just wanted to start with where I'm coming from. So as Colin mentioned, I've done a lot of work in the tropics, but I really kind of started thinking about forest biogeochemistry and carbon cycling and essentially dynamics of recovering forests in New England, but then moved to working in recovering tropical forests in Costa Rica and Mexico, both in dry and wet tropical forests. I also did a bit of a stint in Hawaii and threatened and rare plant reintroductions. But I've kind of really been thinking this whole time on how to better integrate ecological theory into restoration practice. And this is quite challenging, but I think that we've come up with some really nice guidelines, and now we're focusing really on the kind of innovations in restoration that we can use to scale up. So I work at ETH in the Crowther Lab, and this is a group of, I think in total, it ranges from 40 to 60 people kind of month to month. But we have core groups that are focused on global vegetation ecology, microbial ecology, fundamentals, landscape ecology, and then I and Daisy Dent lead the restoration ecology group. Mostly, again, very focused on tropical forest restoration, but have been doing a lot of work on global restoration outcomes recently. And I think a lot of this intro is a bit of preaching to the choir, but a lot of the work that we do is really trying to promote nature-based solutions to climate and the biodiversity crises. So reforestation and conserving existing forests has enormous climate mitigation potential. We can essentially kind of bend the curve with about accounting for about 1/3 of global emissions just through reforestation, improved management, and forest preservation alone. Obviously, a major focus still needs to be on emissions reduction, but there's just incredible potential here. And this is a figure that I really love, and I'll talk everyone through it, that really kind of shows how to bring conservation and restoration together. So this is kind of the like restoration conservation continuum, and Susan Cook-Patton and colleagues have really kind of framed this as land protection, land management, and land restoration. And the larger circles here you see are essentially the carbon drawdown potential that you have, kind of rough estimates from each one of these buckets. And then the small circles are how much you get for your dollar. So you can see on the left-hand side, it kind of ranges from protection being the smallest carbon mitigation potential over to restoration with the highest. But restoration is the smallest inner circle, which actually means it's the most expensive. So we obviously have to focus on the land protection and management first, but restoration also has this massive potential. So that's kind of why I've kind of shifted and I have a lot of my focus on that. And within restoration, then it's not just, okay, it's incredibly expensive. In all cases, we have another gradient, which is from natural regeneration to more assisted approaches. So natural regeneration is just letting areas recover on their own, and this can happen at massive scale in a lot of cases. But where areas are quite degraded, we need to take more of an assisted approach. Typically, this has been done in forests and tree planting, but there's a whole bunch of things within this that I'll kind of get into today. And there are these massive scale targets that people have basically pledged to restore hundreds of millions of hectares across the world, but we're consistently falling, kind of failing to meet these targets. And a lot of this is just because it's expensive to do this work, and it's also just kind of hard to get boots on the ground to do it well. There's these really broad scale estimates that we have massive funding gaps to halt and reverse biodiversity decline. We need billions and billions more dollars invested in this. So we obviously need to unlock the funding for this, but we also need to use it more efficiently. And some of these really big examples of large-scale tree plantation or tree kind of planting initiatives where people go out and they plant kind of 1 million trees in a week or a day have also shown to be kind of quite negative and actually not to work. And a lot of this is poor planning or just the fact that this is kind of implemented sometimes just as like a publicity stunt. But we can use this capacity and the fact that we are able to do large scale assisted restoration to do good. It's just more of like focusing and making sure that we're doing this in a way that the trees and kind of persist over time. And there's tons of people working on this, and there's been enormous strides in the past decade to make this kind of work better. There's just also lots of efficiencies that we can improve too. So I've kind of thought about this a lot and really think that this can be put into 3 main categories in the solutions that we need to upscale restoration. One, we need incentives. So restoration has to be economically viable or legally mandated for it to actually happen, to basically deal with the opportunity cost of transitioning from conventional land use. We also need innovation. So this is things like what Funga is doing with fungal microbial inoculation that make landscape interventions more cost effective. And then we need the interventions after we do them to persist. So these need to be sustainable economically for local communities and broader communities. And really what we've been focusing on is thinking about the innovations that enable these things. So there's also just been so much extensive work on where to apply restoration approaches at scale, tons of prioritization, but not as much on how to do this. So that's really kind of where our group and a lot of people are headed. So I just want to kind of talk through some stories and kind of briefly go over some results that we have so far from this work. And we really put our work in our group into 3 main categories. One is we're doing really large scale synthesis work. This can be meta-analyses. We come through tons of different studies and try to look at restoration successes and failures. The second is we realize that to prioritize future research and just to understand what restoration is happening on the ground, we need to talk to practitioners. So we've started doing a lot of surveys distributed directly to practitioners and informational interviews and lots of work to know where their main challenges are. And then the third is where I really came from, and I'm kind of working on scaling up, is trying to implement a global experimental restoration network. And there's been kind of amazing work that's been done on the natural recovery of forests. There's great plot networks that show how much biodiversity and carbon and how function changes over time in just naturally regenerating forests, but not as much on the assisted side of things. So we're trying to bring this together in partnership with NGOs. So yeah, I'll kind of go through these 3 different categories and what we've been doing. And some of this is just to make everyone aware of these big syntheses that we're doing, but kind of working on pulling results together still. So the first one is a big synthesis that we've done in collaboration with an organization called Collaborative Earth. And we basically set this project up because we've realized that there's a lot of information on the carbon accumulation and biodiversity recovery in restoration projects that's unpublished in academic literature. So we started this really big literature review, starting just traditionally with normal searches, just like scientists usually do. But then we've really worked on bringing in gray literature, which is this literature that essentially is a massive amount of work in reports and non-English literature sources that is really where a lot of this information is kind of exists because practitioners are focused on doing the work, not on then getting their results published in the scientific journal. So this has been an ongoing thing for 2 years, and we're really starting at this point to now pull everything together. We still mostly have, at least for carbon outcomes, which is our first focus, mostly data from peer-reviewed literature, but we were able to add about 20% additional sites from all this gray literature, and that's still continuing. So this is kind of a stay tuned, but the idea here is really that we're trying to create these global databases of assisted restoration outcomes that can be paired with the natural regeneration work that has been done really, really well around the world so that we can kind of compare and basically understand, should we be actually doing something on the assisted side or just letting nature recover? And then a next kind of synthesis project that I really loved putting together and just actually came out recently in a publication was trying to assess just innovations in assisted landscape restoration. So we basically compared all these approaches that are all these dots on this map, from just throwing seeds on the ground to adding biochar to doing microbial inoculation to a business as usual practice, which I'll explain what we mean by that. And really found that these practices can help to improve vegetation recovery outcomes of restoration in many, many cases. So here's an example of what we're calling business as usual. On the left-hand side here, we see a big open field in a regenerating tropical forest. This field has been regenerating for about 30 years. And you can see there's some scattered trees, but not really much has happened. It's really slow to recover. On the right-hand side, you see this really lush canopy. This is about actually, it's only actually been regenerating for about 15 years since the innovation was applied. And this is a case where people dumped thousands of tons of orange peels to kind of jumpstart succession. It basically killed all the grass and brought in all these birds and bats and seed dispersers, and then the forest recovery was much faster. So we're trying to identify these innovations in the literature. And how we did this was we started with just an internal list, and then we had a big workshop in 2022 with a whole bunch of restoration practitioners, mostly working in Latin America, but also with experience in the African and Southeast Asian tropics. And we came up with a big list of what these practitioners said were kind of the biggest like innovations or just things that should be used more in restoration. And I'll go into these when I present a figure, but they're basically different things that are variations in planting in forests and then soil amendments in these two different kind of main areas. And I just wanted to thank everyone that was involved in this, including Colin. This was a massive effort with all of us pulling this together. And also the big reason that this was so successful was that we really worked with the practitioners to put all of this together. And this is just generally what you do for a big review like this. We identified the innovations. We then did some screening and found about 6,000 studies that mentioned them. And then eventually ended up with 143 studies where we have observations of some type of vegetation recovery, which is biomass carbon accumulation, growth and survival, some plant diversity metrics and structure that compared the innovations to a business as usual approach. And these papers have kind of really increased almost exponentially over time. So we take this to mean that these approaches are kind of becoming a bit more studied in the literature, and we kind of captured what we needed to for that. So now for the exciting stuff. So what we find is that these innovations improve restoration outcomes about 86% of the time by either improving vegetation recovery or enabling scaling by improving kind of cost benefit. So the figures that I'll show here are these kind of beautiful Tetris looking plots on the left-hand side. Each square here indicates an outcome in terms of vegetation recovery. And the blue squares mean that an innovation had a higher outcome than a business as usual approach. The beige are the same, and then lower are orange. So overall, when you put all these innovations together, essentially you see most of the time, it's about half of the time they improve the outcomes. Sometimes and a lot of times they're the same, but they might actually be in a lot of cases less expensive. So a same outcome isn't actually a bad outcome. It's quite good in a lot of cases because it improves the cost effectiveness of it. And to get to what these things actually are, we compared kind of these planting approaches versus soil amendments. And the first ones are kind of focused on different types of planting. So number one, mixed plantings is plant biodiverse species mixes. We already know this. This is a sanity check. It's really, really important to do this. And we find that the mixed plantings, which are compared to monocultures, have much higher outcomes. An interesting approach that we have in here too is economic species, which is meaning actually mixing native tree species with mixtures of species that are economically valuable. They don't have to be native. For example, there's some really good examples in Brazil where they're strip planting eucalyptus with native trees, and then they clear cut the eucalyptus after 10 years, and it can almost offset the entire cost of the restoration, and also has higher vegetation recovery outcomes overall. Spatially patterned planting is something that people also refer to a lot as applied nucleation. And this is like not planting the entire area. So you kind of plant trees and islands, and then you let natural recovery happen. There's kind of mixed results for this, but in general, applied nucleation costs about half of what it costs to do normal tree planting. So in terms of cost benefit, it's really great. And then there's mixed results for what we're calling alternative revegetation, which is just planting or spreading seeds or sticking kind of cuttings of plants directly into the ground. But this is also much more, it's much more cost effective. So you might have lower outcome, but essentially it costs a lot less. So we really were hoping to do like a really detailed cost benefit analysis for this, but we found in the literature, we rarely found anyone reporting information on costs. So we're trying to basically reach out to companies and others that probably have those cost data at this point to really kind of bring that all together. And then the last three pieces are the soil amendments. So soil microbiome, biowaste, and biochar. And there are really kind of excellent outcomes from a lot of these. We don't know as much about biochar, but there's kind of a lot of instances where these have been used to kind of create really positive outcomes. So we basically argue that the top ones are mixed plantations and economic species that people should use. But I also wanted to point out here that things like soil microbiome inoculation, like Funga is doing, we observed no negative outcomes across any of our kind of studies that we found. So this is just a really good indication that this is an innovation that needs to be used more and trialed more so we understand how it works in different systems. And then I wanted to just point out again this kind of orange peel project. That's my pet project because there are really nice outcomes of these bio-waste treatments, but when we start splitting them out into what we know about different types, we can split bio-waste into agriculture, compost addition, or the application of effluent and sewage. We have 5 instances in all the literature where we see agricultural waste use. One is these orange peel addition, one is coffee pulp, and they all have positive outcomes. So this isn't a statistically kind of significant result that we know we should use these, but we just argue that these are things that need to be trialed and used more, essentially. So really, these innovations have this capacity to catalyze vegetation recovery. And compared to business as usual, we really think that they should be used more when they can be. But we still need more information on the costs. And we're only 5% of all of these studies we found anyone that mentioned costs. And then everyone usually assesses outcomes at really small scales, like less than 1 hectare. So we really need these projects, these massive scale ecosystem restoration projects that are applying these and other innovations at scale. And there's been really like historic investment by a lot of big tech companies in reforestation projects in Brazil and elsewhere. So this is becoming a reality. And we've also even been approached by a big funder that wants to try to build this work into RFPs for projects as well now too. So there's a way to actually start testing this stuff. And then I just wanted to go briefly through our next kind of big projects that we have going on, which are looking at just evaluating restoration practices across Latin America. So we did a really large scale survey. A lot of this work I'm doing very closely with my colleague, Rebecca Cole, who lives in Costa Rica. And we really are doing these surveys to understand what challenges practitioners face and then help them scale up their work. So one really interesting thing that we found from this project was there was just a mismatch between what people are measuring in terms of looking at their outcomes and what their main goals are. So on the left-hand side, you can see people's motivation for doing restoration. On number 1 is always conserving biodiversity. We are running a global survey right now that validates this same result. But biodiversity recovery isn't measured. So seedling growth and tree survival are the things that are being measured. And this isn't because the projects don't want to do this. It's that they lack tools and the funders aren't really funding them to do this as much, at least the projects that we spoke to. So we're really focusing on trying to do capacity building to kind of improve this. But one really positive thing that kind of came out of this project was that we found that a lot of approaches shift to using natural regeneration at scale. So ecologists have been yelling into the void for 20 years now about how natural recovery should be kind of prioritized in larger scale projects. And we do see this happening. So on this figure, the kind of vertical axis here is the scale of implementation. So at the bottom, these are projects that are happening at smaller scales, like the bottom rows. And then the top is projects that are happening at over 100 hectares. And the lighter colors are on the kind of passive or natural recovery side of things. So projects seem to really shift over to using natural recovery at scale, which is really kind of great that the science is starting to trickle down, and also people are just generally using these approaches, which can be much more cost effective at larger scales. And yeah, I mentioned the capacity building. So through all this work, we really focus on identifying gaps in training, and we've had lots of workshops online about monitoring and building diverse nurseries and all this stuff, because we also need to really make sure that the restoration practitioners get the knowledge that they need to kind of improve the work that they're doing when they don't have that specific training available to them. Yeah, and then the main last project that I've been working on and don't have results yet, but we're kind of starting to actually receive data back from projects, is a distributed experiment where we work with NGOs to assess assisted recovery versus natural regeneration. And all we do in this case is we ask these projects that are primarily tree planting nonprofits to install control plots where they look at vegetation recovery in natural regeneration, because they're paid to do the assisted recovery, which is the tree planting. And then we now have a bunch of plots across Latin America where people are comparing these two approaches, which is really happens kind of in an experimental framework. And then in the future, what we're hoping to do is try to kind of improve and increase the amount of comparisons that we're making here. So these could be the innovations I was mentioning, add soil microbiome and coffee waste addition, and lots of other stuff that we can actually try to basically develop the scoping mechanism that we can actually understand, at least at small scales, what restoration approaches work in different contexts. And at this point, we, over the past years, have partnered with 20 organizations across all of these countries, and then interviewed a whole lot more about potential interest, and kind of categorize data that they're interested in sharing, and involve them in all those capacity building workshops. Yeah, and I just figured I'd give like a really brief preview what's up next, especially because I think one of these pieces might actually be interesting to some people in the room. This is really a dream that my postdoc and I are trying to realize at this point. So my postdoc, Sarah Lofquist, has done a lot of work on social justice implications of restoration. She's an ecological economist. And what we're trying to do at this point is think about a framework in which we connect $1 of funding, so this is all the funding sources on the left-hand side of this figure, to an ecological outcome on the ground or a livelihood outcome. And there's a lot of steps to do this. So we're basically putting this all together kind of as we go. We have students that are working on the intervention side of things, looking at improving management, a student working on optimizing funding flows to projects. We're also thinking essentially about how different types of funding sources, like for carbon credits and biodiversity credits or philanthropy money, lead to different types of outcomes. And in order to actually do all this, we need to have like the outcome data linked to a specific project polygon, so or kind of a spatially explicit area on the ground. So we're working with a spinoff of the Crowther Lab called Restore that essentially maps biodiversity, kind of restoration and conservation projects all over the world. And through that, we're essentially trying to track where the funding is going. And then if we know that we're exactly where the project implemented the funding, then we can track the ecological outcomes. And then we're kind of gathering data on livelihoods with surveys and lots of other things. So this is something that's going to probably take me the next 10 years of my career to put together, but we're really thinking about how to do it and really try to optimize funding so that it flows in the right way to basically lead to the best outcomes that we possibly can have. And yeah, this is the last piece that, as putting this talk together, I kind of realized that people might be interested in being at least data contributors to this. So we have a working group that we just started with TNC and WCS. It's this really cool mechanism that they have called the Science for Nature and People Partnerships. And this is a collaboration with my colleague Laura and Jennifer and Juliana, who's at TNC. And we're essentially trying to use long-term restoration data sets to see if we can predict long-term outcomes from short-term data. So the idea here is that we need to really understand how long we should track restoration project success. And a lot of this will probably start with looking at natural recovery because we have a lot of data from that side of things. But if anyone has any leads on data sets or is interested in potentially being kind of a side collaborator on this, we're really just starting this. We had this kickoff meeting last Friday, and we're super excited to just try to bring people in. And ideally, like the main goal of this is really to produce tools for practitioners so they can improve their monitoring. So that's what SNAP does, is kind of funds creating outputs that help practitioners do their work better. So just figured I would mention it. And that's it. And I'll just leave everyone here with this picture of tens of or thousands of tons of orange peels, because I find this to be really a fascinating example of innovation and restoration. Thanks.
Wow, oranges. That's my take home. Thank you so much for sharing your work. I think you said you've thought about this a lot, and I think that's very much putting it lightly. So thank you for all your work in this area. We're going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, please drop it in the chat and we'll go through those sequentially. But before we get to audience questions, I just want to ask you, you as someone who's thought a lot about, what are the bottlenecks to scaling restoration, I think you've definitely identified money as the biggest one, right? Like these things are expensive. But after that, like if you could like make one of these bottlenecks go away, like which one would you attack first and why?
It's a great question. And I realize I talked a lot about money in this talk, but Honestly, in my opinion, and I think this is really maybe more common knowledge now, the biggest bottlenecks to scaling restoration are really at the government level. So it's really governance and that, I mean, really interesting. I'm really digging into this like survey data we have from 500 practitioners around the world. They almost never mention ecological bottlenecks. They mention funding, and then they mention the fact that there's outdated legal frameworks that really affect them implementing their work. So they're trying to do work and they can't get permits. It's like really difficult, or the government doesn't support them. So there's a whole bunch of pieces, and I think the governance piece is the most important, and definitely very, very, very. I mean, this can change with every. I mean, we see this happening in the U.S. now, with every kind of new wave of politicians that come in. This is the kind of stuff that we need legally mandated frameworks that carry through rather than change administration to administration. So that I think is in my mind, the biggest challenge to make restoration persist. And that's like, we can get it happen. We can make it happen on the ground if we unlock the funding, but we need to make sure that it becomes economically viable in the long term, and governance is a really big piece.
That makes sense. Yes. Changing administrations is definitely affecting a lot right now. Okay, I'm going to go through some questions we have in the chat. The first one is actually about Miyawaki forests. I'm sure you've encountered this practice before. I wonder if you could just like give us your, 1,000-foot understanding of what the Miyawaki practice is and anything you've learned in your research about its effectiveness, whether it's cost or ecologically or anything else.
Yeah, and so Miyawaki method in general is there's a whole bunch to it, but the gist essentially is that you plant trees at really, really, really high density. So we're talking like 1,000 per hectare when usually we plant, sorry, 10,000 per hectare when usually we plant about 1,000. So you also plant really high diversity species mixes, and you use compost and use soil amendments and a whole bunch of things at the same time. But honestly, from an ecological standpoint, the thing you're really doing is you're just planting tons and tons and tons of trees in the same place. And the idea essentially is that this jumpstarts restoration because you're putting all this stuff in at the same time. And I've actually read a decent amount about this, but there are not many examples of long-term Miyawaki method projects. There's a couple in Japan that are like 20 to 30 years old that seem to be working quite well. But it's very expensive, and it also doesn't make the most sense to me because you're putting tons and tons of species that are just kind of then going to get, in a lot of cases, stuck. So they're all going to compete with each other, and then you kind of have this arrested succession occur. So I know it's worked in certain cases, but I think it's one of these things that we really need to either think about trialing at really small scales because it's super expensive in lots of different areas to scale it up. And also just thinking about the ecology of it. Does it make sense for us to plant that many trees at high density? So people are using this in like urban forestry stuff, and maybe it does in like a small patch, but definitely not at the scale of tens of thousands of hectares, because if you say we're going to spend 10 times as much on doing the restoration, then the outcome has to be 10 times as high, right? So I think that's kind of where I'm at, but I do think it needs more trials and data to understand where it might work.
Got it. Next question. I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse or not, but Bart is curious about your thoughts about Paul Stamets's work on petroleum breakdown with fungi. I don't know if you're familiar with this or know anything about it.
I mean, I love Paul Stamets, but I do not know about petroleum breakdown.
I've seen some of this work. I think the challenging thing about it is usually he's applying fungi to like a heap of petroleum contaminated soil. And then, there's like A, B, right? Like there's fungi added or not. And there's evidence that adding fungi increase the breakdown of petroleum, but often those experiments aren't replicated, and so it's really challenging to interpret them. But there's definitely other literature looking at the role of fungi in degrading petroleum products, and there's definitely promise there. I'd definitely call it something that's understudied for sure. I'm going to move on here. We have another question about bio-waste application. Someone's working with bokashi fermentation of organics to produce what sounds like a compost tea solution to jumpstart soil microbiology. Any experience with things like that?
So not really. We do have a experiment in Costa Rica that actually Rebecca is leading, that is actually looking at kind of a compost tea application and just it. So not just native microbiome inoculation, but like a really interesting thing that they call MAMA, where they basically get the native forest soil and then they mix with a bunch of stuff and then they apply it. We have found mixed results in the tropics with this, but I think we're still kind of learning about how this might actually work as an application. But I definitely found from that review that we did that there were a lot of just bulk compost applications in a lot of cases, actually mostly in northern latitudes, that worked really, really well. I think we're less certain on how this best works in the tropics, but certainly I think this is something that we did find in general compost to have positive outcomes on vegetation recovery for sure.
Just to add a little bit to that, generally the idea is waste management of organics, right? And people are a little bit concerned in some cases of just dumping your trash into the woods, so the idea is to have a culture mix of lactobacillus and some fungi that then ferments it, and then you can spread it more easily through that compost tea. So that's why I asked. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for the clarification. And that's a really good point. And something that then, so the sad thing that I don't mention of the orange peel project was that the orange peel company was actually sued by another orange peel company. And because of exactly what you're mentioning, because they argue, the other orange peel company essentially just wanted the other one to not get benefit from this, but they were saying, oh, you haven't thought about all of the implications of dumping all of this bio-waste. So that certainly needs to be thought through. And I think Rebecca's kind of started to do this with coffee waste application and other things like that. So there is work that needs to be done. But I think we can learn from Scandinavia, and there's actually been a ton of application that I had no idea before I did this review. There's been a lot of work in the temperate zone, actually looking at application of just sewage, like processed sewage, and it's worked really well. So they've clearly been able to get around some of the regulations there. So I think we kind of need to look for the examples where that's worked, but super cool to hear that you maybe have an approach that helps to deal with some of that concern too.
All right. We have a question about, you spoke a lot about, helping restoration projects build sort of some experimental design into their work. And how do you go about, like, from a technical point of view, asking practitioners to deploy these sort of like control plots? And especially in the context of thinking about scaling short-term outcomes to longer-term outcomes?
Yeah, so we don't ask much. So we are working with smaller plots here. We're basically asking people to install a quarter of a hectare plot, which I guess can be large space in certain cases, 50 by 50 meters. And then in cases where there's kind of grazing animals, we ask them to put a fence in, but that's pretty much it. That's the only request. And then they're only measuring plant biodiversity recovery, not of anything that was planted. So obviously in their control plots, it's just all natural recovery, and then some really basic structure measurements. So the plot installation itself I think is quite flexible. We have a standard for this, but what has been the biggest challenge is making really simplified protocols that everyone can follow. And we've really stripped this down to the kind of bare minimum just to try to get at least the baseline data and look at recovery. I would like to run that experiment for, well, I really want to get the data set back at year 5. I'm not really worried about these like really fine scale, what happens in the first 2-3 years, like that would be maybe interested for ecology. I'm kind of interested in like a 5-year time scale of, can we get 5 years of data? Can we get 10 years of data? And maybe that's enough to then kind of compare to for the early recovery. And obviously long-term is a different picture, but I think as long as, like, obviously we'd want to keep these plots going for as long as we possibly can, but then sometimes the space becomes, I mean, more valuable for the project to take and turn into something else. But hopefully in a lot of cases, the natural recovery might, or not a lot, but hopefully in some cases it will be faster than the tree planting itself. And then they'll choose to switch back over to that once we kind of get up to speed with carbon accreditation frameworks for that, which Vera does have now. There's like an AFR natural regeneration framework that kind of just got approved. So there's now more ability for these projects to kind of get income for their work from on the natural recovery side of things too. Hopefully that answered your question. There's a lot of thought that's gone into this, but the control plot stuff is quite simple. It's just like thinking about how to measure it in a systematic way is the stuff that is challenging.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like the more you can, the lighter the lift, the more you can deploy. And often replication is the biggest limiter here. We have a question about sort of the human dimension of restoration. And so sometimes we have, there's plenty of restoration projects out there where like one entity, NGO or otherwise, like owns the land and manages the project and like builds the tree nurseries. But often at landscape scale, you're trying to implement something, across a huge geographic landscape where there's different people who are the implementation partners and the landowners and the community members. It's not like a vertically integrated stack. And so is there anything you've learned from your work about how to, be effective when working with that many diverse stakeholders at really large geographic scales?
Yeah, this is really hard. But the thing that has seemed to work the most and stuff that has been the most valuable to me is to really bring as many people, at least for representing different groups, into the same room and start actually having a conversation from the start. So a lot of this is just focused on trying to co-create the project itself and making sure that conflicts, I mean, not all conflicts can be dealt with at the start, but as a project developer, you might not even realize there's a conflict between some stakeholder groups. So having those conversations at the beginning and actually like paying someone to facilitate a meeting and like kind of really doing that work, I've found to be really important. In the tropics, a lot of the times, or like in these countries that we work, people also really argue that the communities themselves should be a part of the project and they should actually be making like sure they're built into the project itself rather than having them just be like kind of labor that is after the project is kind of implemented, then the community isn't getting anything from that. So there has to be a lot of thought about how is the community benefiting in addition to just the kind of employment that they get from the project too. But this is a question that I think is like very, very difficult to answer from different contexts. But I do think though that those like bringing all the stakeholders together and like paying a person who's really, really good at making those conversations happen, like facilitating the thing is really, really important to start. Because I think a lot of the stuff, these things end up coming up that you just didn't even think about because someone has some kind of issue with even like how you're describing the project. And sometimes you can resolve that just from a conversation. And sometimes there's things that you can't resolve, but you just have to think about how you can compromise on.
I love that. We have a question about oranges, which I love. What's so special about orange peel? So how does it scale? Where do you get the oranges? And why do you love it so much?
Okay, so I love the oranges, but it's not just oranges. I think it's like anything that we have like massive scale agricultural waste. The oranges, honestly, maybe wasn't even like the best material because they're not like incredibly nutrient rich. In this system, they actually just help to kill all of the invasive grasses that were planted for cattle grazing. So they kind of like get really hot. It's like it just creates like this layer that just zaps the grass. And that's what Rebecca also found with the kind of coffee waste application as well. Although the coffee waste, I think, actually added a bit more of a nutrient pulse, which was helpful in that sense. So this needs to be something that has like at least some nitrogen in it. Like it has to be like adding a bit of nutrient pulse. It can't be, oh, you're just spreading a bunch of, I think, probably like sugarcane and things over, because also that would be really hard. But something you can apply easily, something that has some nutrients, although we're not totally sure if it's the nutrients. We kind of think it's really just that it kills the grass. And then it also is like attracting things that bring seeds. So in this case, it was a lot of animals and that came to eat all the insects that were decomposing everything. And then like it just dispersed seeds in. And that's really what kind of jump started it in the system itself. So because that's a big missing link in when you kind of have these really degraded landscapes, you just lack seed sources. So it's getting those seeds there faster. So anything that can do that, I think, is key. So not all agricultural waste would work. And there's a lot of challenges with doing this, because it does mean you have to spend the money to truck it all in and all this. But I think that when it can be local scale application, it certainly has a lot of potential. And the same thing with like biochar. If you have a local biochar reactor, this can work. But the second that you have to be importing it and paying all those costs, it then is not cost effective anymore.
Okay, and then we have another question about the biowaste stuff. I think speaking to this last point you're making about costs, like what are the barriers to accessing, these biowastes, and like, is there an opportunity here, right? Like clearly they're paying to get that waste removed, and so is there an opportunity to use what they would have paid there to finance these alternative uses? And this is from Angela Fulton.
Yeah, so I think in certain cases there would be. I think it needs to be kind of dealt with case by case. So when Rebecca was looking into the coffee application, there was certain countries that actually make a lot of money off of the waste itself. So they have like products that they're creating from it. So it wouldn't make much sense you'd basically be buying it for them rather than just repurposing and getting rid of it. So I think this is something that, I mean, I don't think this is a silver bullet that's going to solve everything. I just think that there is a potential to go in and actually reach out to these really large scale kind of ag waste producers and see if this could be feasible and like how much they're actually paying to get rid of it, if they are. I mean, and sometimes they're composting it, but then maybe they're not using the compost, or you could buy the compost for them. I mean, I think there's just a whole bunch of different ways to think about it. But I do think, like I showed that slide, we have 5 cases of this happening in the academic literature. We need more information to understand that. But that's like where the cost benefit feasibility stuff really needs to be done. And I'm kind of arguing that is really what we need to do in restoration, is just get an idea of what these things cost, and as many of them as we possibly can.
Agreed. Yes. Well, with that, we're all out of questions and we're all out of time. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It's always good to have, broader understanding of what's going on in restoration regionally and globally. At Funga, we'll be continuing the seminar series. We do it once a quarter. For Q1 2025, we have Dr. Jasper Wubbs joining us to talk about ecosystem microbiome restoration in heathland ecosystems in Northern Europe, really a pioneer there. So please join us for that. And let's thank Dr. Werden one more time for sharing with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Find my Zoom clap, maybe.
Thank you so much. I also want to mention that a recorded version will be shared via email for everybody that registered. So keep an eye out for that. And then we also share it on a LinkedIn, and hope to see you all next time in January.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming.